I'm JC, and welcome to another episode of Confident Real Estate. Today we're going to be discussing Estoppel Certificates and Subordination, Non-disturbance and Attornment Agreements, also known as SNDAs. What are they? When do we need them? And pretty much why do we care? You know what? In order to really discuss this, it's been a long day. We're going to take this to the home office and get comfortable. Okay, much better. So, what is an Estoppel certificate? Anytime you deal with commercial real estate, whether it be retail on the ground floor or a commercial shopping center or some kind of office building, any kind of commercial asset class space where there's a tenant in place, I should say, you're going to need an Estoppel certificate. So, again, what is an Estoppel certificate? It's very simple. Don't let it get confusing or seem too complicated. In fact, let's start here. This is a ball. This is a tape measure. This is a piece of paper. So, an Estoppel certificate is basically a piece of paper that says certain information that's relevant to you because it's coming from the tenant. If it's a tenant Estoppel certificate, the tenant of that commercial space that you're purchasing is verifying to you as the purchaser that what the seller told you is correct. Part of your due diligence for any property that you're going to be purchasing is to review the leases that go with that property, whether residential or commercial. And if you didn't catch the episode where we discussed due diligence in detail, click the link below. It's worth your time. Anyway, reviewing commercial leases are more complicated typically than reviewing residential leases. Why? Because residential leases are standard boilerplate for the most part with maybe a specialized rider or some language attached, but they're going to be the same for every residential tenant, where a commercial lease is going to be different because each tenant's business is different. There's different terms, there's different things that a tenant needs, like a restaurant versus a nail salon versus a craft store versus a barber shop. You get where I'm going with this. So, that being said, what are your options? You review the leases yourself, obviously, but you could also have an attorney review the leases for you and prepare what's called a lease abstract, which is basically a summary of the material terms of each lease. That can get expensive. So if that's not in your budget, and even if it is, you should also have the seller provide you with what's called a tenant Estoppel certificate. A tenant Estoppel certificate essentially is a certificate with material terms of the lease that the tenant is acknowledging and the responsible party for the tenant is signing off on as their understanding of those same material terms you read. So you know that they view it the same way you view it. So, what specifically goes on that piece of paper? Let's get into it. Before we start, it's important to note that if you're going to be purchasing the property with financing from a mortgage lender, that lender is typically going to require tenant Estoppel certificates or seller Estoppel certificates, which we'll get to, for each of your commercial tenants. Typically, the lender will require tenant Estoppel certificates, and you should as well, even if you're not purchasing with lender financing, for any of the anchor tenants which make up the majority of either the square footage or the rent roll. Usually it's both. Okay, let's get started. A tenant Estoppel certificate. What are the terms most commonly detailed within an Estoppel certificate? First, and these are all pretty obvious, the name of the tenant, the legal entity name, and the name they do business under, which may be slightly different from the official legal entity name. Confirmation of the unit or area that they are renting. You want to make sure they understand that they're renting unit 101, which is detailed on a sketch or a illustration of the floor plan attached to the tenant Estoppel certificate, and not that they think it's unit 101, which is 3,000 square feet versus the 2,000 square feet the seller has shown it to you as being. That's 1,000 square foot difference you don't want to find out about after you've purchased the property. Next, the date of the lease commencement and the date that it terminates. You want to know also if there are any remaining renewal or perhaps expansion options. Does the tenant have the right to expand into the neighboring store if that tenant next door goes out of business? Something you want to be aware of. What's a renewal or extension option? It's pretty self-explanatory, but essentially, let's say you have a tenant on their initial term, they have a 10-year lease with 5-year extension options, which then carry them out for an additional 25 years for a total term of 35 years, all covered under the initial lease. You want to make sure that that tenant, when they reach their extension options, that they understand the rent they're going to owe is the same amount that you're planning to collect based on your interpretation of the lease and the extension options. That figure, that dollar amount figure, will be determined in the initial lease as either a set number or as a percentage increase year over year, carrying all the way out until the end of the initial term, and then for each subsequent extension or renewal term. It's very important so that you, as the future landlord, know what you're going to be collecting and you confirm that your tenant is on the same page with you. And also, in case you want to sell the property in the future, you want to make sure that the value of the property is in those leases and that the future purchaser can be guaranteed that the tenant has the same understanding as you do and as they will as the future purchaser, that this is what the rents that will be received will be in that future period. Makes sense, right? Acknowledgement from the tenant of the fixed rent that they paid for the month in which they are signing this actual Estoppel certificate. This is a way for you to line up the month in which the Estoppel certificate is being signed with the month in the lease that is equal to where you are in the term. So if you're in a 10-year lease and the tenant has been there 15 years from the date when the lease was first signed, the initial term is obviously over. You're now in the extension period. You want to make sure that as of the date they are signing the Estoppel certificate, the amount of rent they are paying is equal to what you calculate the rent to be during that extension term. Any other charges billed to the tenant, such as real estate taxes. If the entire property is billed under one tax bill, then you want to make sure each tenant is paying their proportionate share of the real estate taxes as additional rent. That will be calculated in the initial term of the lease. There's also something called common area maintenance or CAM charges. Common area maintenance, if you've ever been to a shopping mall and you go to a food court and there's restaurants on the outskirts of the food court area with a center full of tables and chairs that everybody fights for and tries to claim as theirs so they can eat their meal, that area where the tables are is actually a common area that each of the restaurants pays a proportionate share of common area maintenance for, and that is to keep that area clean. The people you see employed at the mall, who are employed by the owner of the mall, who keep that area clean, their salaries are paid out of the common area maintenance that every single one of the food vendors on the outskirts of the food court pays into, based on how big their restaurant is. That accounts for the percentage of payment into common area maintenance that they pay. You want an acknowledgement from the tenant that they're in possession of the leased premises under their lease, and that the premises that they're leasing hasn't been sublet to somebody else or otherwise assigned, and if it has, you want to know the details behind that. You want the tenant to confirm that the lease that they're referring to is the same lease you are, so you want to confirm that it's the lease dated on X date and that it remains unmodified and in full force and effect, and you want to probably attach a copy of it to the Estoppel certificate to make sure you're both looking at the same document, and you want them to confirm that there are no modifications or amendments, and if there are, where are they? Let's attach those to the Estoppel certificate as well. The tenant should confirm that they have no rights in connection with the property or any portion of it, Such tenant rights might include the ability to occupy the space next door should it become vacant down the road, or to minimize the footprint they have at the property if the business isn't doing so well, or some other combination of compromise that may have been agreed to in the initial lease. You also want to make sure that the tenant has no right to purchase the property, what's called a right of first refusal, that may compromise your ability to go forward with this particular purchase yourself. That, however, should be covered in the seller representations, and if you missed the episode we did where we covered seller representations, click the link below. You also want the tenant to confirm that there is no uncured default either on their part or on the landlord's part under the lease, and that there is no what's called an offset against the rent or any of the additional rent charges, basically reasons for the tenant to withhold the rent, and no situation is currently existing that if the landlord doesn't do something to fix it, could create a situation where they have the ability to withhold rent, or a situation where the landlord would be in default. You definitely don't want to purchase the property and then find out that one of these situations exists and it's now your problem to clean it up. What are examples of a current situation that may result in a default or a breach of the lease down the road? Well, in the tenant side of the equation, a big box tenant, one of your anchor tenants, may be parking storage pods or unloading trucks in the main parking lot, taking up tons of spaces, and more likely parking them in front of the neighboring tenant who's now complaining and saying to you there's a big problem and their customers can't park and nobody can see their signage from the street. From the landlord's perspective, they may be in default, the person you're purchasing the property from, that seller, they may be in default because maybe there's a leak in the roof and they told the tenant, listen, I'm about to sell the property. Shh, keep it quiet. The new landlord, that's you, they'll fix it. I already told them about it. They know everything about it. They agreed to fix it as soon as they purchased the property. You don't want to find that out after you've purchased the property. Along those same lines, you want to make sure that the tenant acknowledges that the landlord has, to their satisfaction, performed, and that the tenant has accepted all of the work, if any, that the landlord was required to perform under the terms of the lease, such as how they built out the space or any repairs that needed to be done or maintenance, etc. Next, you want to find out who the guarantor is for the tenant obligations under the lease and when the guarantee was dated if it's separate from the lease agreement. Sometimes there's a separate guarantee agreement, or it's a set of provisions within the lease itself, and an individual, usually the deep-pocketed person who owns the tenant entity, guarantees personally to a certain extent the obligations of that tenant. Basically, the person who's on the hook. Another thing of great importance is that the tenant acknowledges there are no credits or abatements of rent that have been granted by the landlord in the past 24 months. What is a credit or abatement? That could be the landlord saying, hey, for every 12 months that you pay rent on time, I'm going to give you 1 month free rent. Seldom happens in the commercial context, but it could, and you don't want to find out about it after you've purchased the property. As I stated before, you want tenant estoppel certificates from all of the tenants, but especially from the big anchor tenants who make up the majority of the rent roll or take up the majority of the space at the actual property. You also want these certificates to be dated as close to the closing as possible. If you have a lender involved, they're going to want them to be dated no more than 30 days, usually, no more than 30 days prior to the closing of the property, so that they make sure nothing has changed between the date the estoppel certificates were signed and the date they hand you the money to help you buy the property. What are seller estoppels? The seller may not be willing or able to chase down all of the tenants, especially the smaller ones. So they may obligate themselves to go and get tenant estoppel certificates from the larger anchor tenants. But when it comes to the smaller tenants, they'll obligate themselves to use reasonable or commercially reasonable efforts to go and track these smaller tenants down in order to get the estoppel certificates from them. But if they can't, they'll give you what's called a seller's estoppel, which basically is all the same information that you'd find in the tenant estoppel certificate. However, instead of the actual tenant verifying the information, the seller is verifying the information to you. Obviously, a seller's estoppel certificate is not the same as a tenant's estoppel certificate because the tenant isn't actually saying, I acknowledge that these are the material terms of the lease and I agree that your understanding meets my understanding and we're on the same page. It's the seller saying, yeah, trust me, this is what it says, and the tenant will verify it. Again, these are coming from the smaller tenants, so they're not the majority of your rent roll, but they're still important and they're still part of your rent roll. So the liability here is you're going to want to make sure that the representations that seller makes in the seller estoppel certificate survives the closing period. You want to make sure that they survive closing, hopefully indefinitely, but if the seller's represented by good legal counsel, they're going to say to you, we're going to cap the survival at, they may say 9 months, if so, try to get to 12 months. They may say 3 months, if so, try to get to 6 months. Whatever that term is, that's going to be the cap on the survival of the seller estoppel. And that should hopefully give you ample time to figure out if there was any misrepresentation that ends up being detrimental to you. And if there is, and it equates to a monetary value, then you want to be able to go after the seller. If the seller, again, is represented by good legal counsel, they're going to come back and say, we'll obligate ourselves to meet a threshold ceiling of no more than X amount of dollars in the event that we materially misrepresented something and it later comes back to have a monetary negative effect on you. Now that you own the property, you're not receiving as much money as you were supposed to, or there's work that we said we were going to do that we didn't actually do, or there's something we knew was a default and now you're coming out of pocket for it. We as a seller obligate ourselves during this survival period to come out of pocket up to, let's say, $100,000, and that's the ceiling, but there's also a floor, and that's the caveat. You can't come back to them and nickel and dime them for every little thing. So they may say you can't make a claim unless your aggregate of your claims exceed $5,000 or $10,000. If you have $15,000 in claims, we'll come out of pocket for it. But if you have $1,000 in claims, that's on you. Don't waste our time. Again, this is all up for negotiation as part of the contract process, and it depends how well you're represented and how well the seller's represented by legal counsel and their own experience and your own experience. That's part of what this is all about, to get you confident to know what to look for and what to ask for. SNDAs, Subordination, Non-disturbance and Attornment Agreements. Right. So, what are they? Once again, just another piece of paper with some express terms on it. When does it come into play? When you get a mortgage loan. Most leases, commercial and residential, have standard boilerplate language that subordinates the leasehold interest of that tenant to a mortgage lender. Meaning, if your leasehold interest tenant is here and subsequent to them signing the lease, the bank comes in with a mortgage loan, they're in second position. If your lease does not have standard subordination language, the SNDA is executed by your tenant, and it essentially is an agreement between your tenant and your lender, whereby the lender steps over your tenant and now they are in the first position and your tenant is in a subordinated second position. And in the event there's a foreclosure, the bank goes first and has priority over the tenant for any interest in the property. It also allows the bank to terminate the lease of the tenant. Not great for your tenant, but hold that thought. So what's the non-disturbance part of the SNDA? Well, that's where the tenant is covered. Remember I told you to hold on a second? It's not always a raw deal for the tenant. The tenant should make sure there's a non-disturbance portion of the SNDA. That essentially says that they will recognize the lender as the landlord in the event of a foreclosure, and in exchange for subordinating their leasehold position in first priority to the subsequent lender, who's now stepped over them again, remember, into the first position. In the event of a foreclosure, the tenant will recognize the bank lender as its new landlord. And in exchange for doing that and subordinating their leasehold interest to the second position in priority, the lender says, okay, as long as you're not in default under the terms of your lease, we'll let you continue to occupy the property and continue to do what you do and run your business, and nothing will change except that the checks now come to us every month instead of the guy we just foreclosed on, who hopefully is never going to be you. And these are the documents that are going to make your lender comfortable enough to make the loan so that you can acquire another property, this time with a commercial component, and continue to build your portfolio confidently. That's it. Before you leave, please don't forget to like this video. And if you want to learn more and continue your confident real estate journey and investment journey, hit subscribe. Until next time, I'm JC, and this is Confident Real Estate.